In order for the heart to contract, it needs a signal from the nervous system. And that's due to nerves that are actually built into the muscle wall. This is called the conducting system of the heart, and it has specialized cells that start and propagate electrical impulses to contractile cells. These specialized cells that you need to be aware of begin with the sinoatrial node, and it's thought of as the heart's pacemaker because it's going to initiate an electrical impulse. That then leads to another specialized region of cells called the atrioventricular node, and it's on the floor of the right atrium. So kind of between the atrium and the ventricle. Conduction from the AV node then leads to the atrioventricular bundle, also called the bundle of His, and that's going to extend into the interventricular septum. Once within the septum, that AV bundle is then going to divide into left and right bundle branches. And these branches then pass to impulses, which are actually directly underneath the endocardium. That's the inner lining of the heart wall. And that's called the subendocardial branches. And they're also called Purkinje fibers. And they begin at the heart's apex. So essentially, we have 5 different specialized regions of cells. We have the sinoatrial node, the AV node, the AV bundle, right and left bundle branches, and then finally the Purkinje fibers. This slide is showing the conducting system of the heart. So the muscle impulse is going to be generated at the sinoatrial node, and that begins sort of on the posterior superior surface of the right atrium. And it's actually very close to where the deoxygenated blood would enter the right atrium from the superior vena cava. There are then nodes that are going to pass between each of these areas. They're called internodal pathways, and they lead to the next step of the conduction system, which is the atrioventricular node, which is shown right here, and that's going to be at the base of the right atrium. So that would be really step number 2. Step number 3 is the atrioventricular bundle, also called the bundle of His. That's going to be located in the interventricular septum. Once the signal reaches the kind of the top of the atrioventricular septum, it splits into 2 different bundle branches. There's a right bundle branch and a left bundle branch. So that would really be number 4. Finally, leads to the subendocardial branches, which are also called Purkinje fibers. So that would be step number 5. So what's shown over in step 2 is that there is an atrioventricular node delay so that the muscle can basically catch up. So what has to happen is once the electrical impulse gets to the AV node, we have to have complete depolarization of the entire atria before we can start to depolarize the ventricle. This is significant because the ventricle is so much larger than the atria. So the atrioventricular node is step number 2. Step number 3 then is the atrioventricular bundle. The bundle conducts the muscle impulse into the interventricular septum. So that's step number 3 in the conduction system. And it leads to the left and right bundle branches. So within the septum, the bundle branches split from the AV bundle. And finally, the muscle impulse is delivered to the subendocardial branches, which would be step number 5 in each ventricle. And then the ventricular myocardium can then contract. Now, the conduction system can basically be measured by the ECG. The ECG is made up of 12 different leads, and it's a composite tracing essentially of the electrical activity of the heart. When we look at an ECG, there's significant waves that we see. They're easy to remember because they're the alphabet. There's the P wave, followed by the QRS complex, and then the T wave. So they're easy to remember if you know your alphabet. So the P wave is responsible for atrial depolarization, and we'll see it on an ECG next, but it basically looks like this. And so the region of the heart has to first depolarize before it can repolarize. So this is the electrical activity. So depolarization leads to contraction of a region of the heart. So it has to first depolarize, then it can contract. So in this case, it would be the atria eventually contracting. Repolarization is going to lead to the relaxation of the heart. So it has to repolarize first, then it can relax. So there's another wave which is responsible for atrial repolarization. We just don't see it because the QRS complex is so big. So it's responsible for ventricular repolarization. And then basically during that, there's another wave responsible for atrial repolarization. It's just covered up because the QRS complex is so big. So it's essentially going to look more spiked like you see here. Following ventricular depolarization is ventricular repolarization, and we can see that with the T wave. And the T wave is going to look like a hump, just like the P wave basically did. So we'll see those on the ECG slide that you see here. So the P wave is shown first here. Within one section, this is where you see the waves. So this would be one heartbeat. This would be another heartbeat, and so on. So within one of these heartbeats, we see the P wave, which is atrial depolarization. So the electrical events are spreading throughout the atrium. The QRS complex is responsible for ventricular depolarization. So the electrical activity is spreading throughout the ventricle while this is occurring. And during this period, there's another wave which is covered up, which is responsible for atrial repolarization. The T wave is responsible for ventricular repolarization. And you can see how it kind of looks just like the P wave. The only difference is it comes after the QRS complex. This slide is reviewing the blood flow through the heart. And I've already kind of mentioned it a little bit, but let's review it. So we're going to begin with the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart would begin with the right atrium. And this chart below it shows you the chamber where it receives blood from, where it sends it to, and what valves it goes through. So for the right atrium, it receives blood from 3 different places: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. We can see the superior and inferior vena cava on the flow chart. That also includes the coronary sinus with deoxygenated blood coming back from the myocardium. That blood goes into the right atrium, which goes through the right atrioventricular valve, also called the tricuspid valve, onto the right ventricle. Blood then is ejected from the right ventricle out through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk. It's there that blood is going to go to the lungs for gas exchange. Once it receives the oxygen, it returns to the left side of the heart through the pulmonary veins. Now it's oxygenated blood. And that's what's kind of being shown by the light red colors on this part of the diagram. On the top part of the diagram, it's a light blue because there's deoxygenated blood on that side of the heart. So blood, fresh oxygenated blood is now in the left atrium. That flows to the left ventricle through the left atrioventricular valve, also called the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. That blood is now in the left ventricle. When the left ventricle ejects, blood goes through the aortic semilunar valve to the aorta, and it enters the ascending aorta, which is the first part of the aorta. Blood goes to the systemic circulation through the systemic arteries, where it's distributed through the entire blood. So at the top of this diagram, we have the pulmonary circuit, which is shown. At the bottom of the diagram, we have the systemic circuit that is found. The only thing really not on here is the coronary circulation. The coronary sulcus, not coronary side, the coronary sulcus is going to deliver deoxygenated blood from the coronary circulation into the right atrium.